It's an interesting question Jesus asked his followers. Who do people say I am? What's the word on the street about me, in other words? Or in this case, the word on the dusty roads of Palestine. It's reasonable to assume that they had paid attention to such a word because they had left everything to follow Jesus. I mean, if you're trusting someone to lead you on a long journey, you're probably interested in knowing the reputation of that person and what the reputation that person has for doing what it is that led you to follow him or her. If, for example, you're following a guide on a multi-day mountain hike, you'd likely want to know that your guide that's leading you into the wilderness has some knowledge of the terrain and a good amount of experience hiking in the mountains. You'd pay attention to what others say about the guide, what reviews he or she may have received. Jesus asks his disciples who people were saying that he was, which is more than just a request for the reviews about him. It goes to his identity, which is incredibly important because this journey the disciples are on leads not just to some place or some goal, but to him and what he offers. Who do people say he is? The disciples promptly list what they've heard, that he may be John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the prophets. That's pretty good company, but it's not Jesus. It may be what folks on the outside think, but they haven't been with Jesus day to day, face to face, 24/7. So then Jesus asks a follow-up question that gets to the heart of the matter. This time he asks what they, his closest followers, think about him. Who do they say he is? It's critical who they understand Jesus to be because they're devoting their lives to following him. Who he is whom they're seeking to be closer to and more like themselves. He is the way. So it's not enough just to have a grasp on what others think about him. The key question is who they say he is. Now Peter speaks up and says, "You are the Messiah." The Greek word we're more accustomed to hearing is the Christ. Either way, it means the anointed one, a term that goes back to the Old Testament and means the one chosen by God for God's unique purpose. This is a remarkable response by Peter, especially since the disciples up to this point seem to be fairly clueless. I mean, even in this same chapter, earlier in chapter 8, the disciples get all confused by Jesus' metaphorical reference to the yeast of the Pharisees and of King Herod, thinking he meant they were out of bread. Jesus is speaking on a deeper level, but they're stuck on the surface. So Peter's proclamation is profound in light of that fact. Scholars, and apparently one of them is the Reverend Brandon Dirks, say this is a pivotal point in Mark's gospel. When Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, this is also a pivotal point for the disciples. Because Peter and his fellow followers of Jesus have in mind a strong king reminiscent of David, who was anointed by the prophet Samuel in accordance with God's direction. Here before them is the anointed one they believe will bring justice to the world and push out the Roman oppressors once and for all, restoring the Davidic kingdom they've read about in the ancient scriptures. They're ready to climb aboard that train heading for triumph in Jerusalem. The problem is, Jesus doesn't hop up into the engine. In fact, in Mark's gospel, right after Peter says that he's the Messiah, Jesus sternly orders them not to tell anyone about him. Now, that doesn't sound like a mighty king about to lead the charge against the enemy. It then gets worse for the disciples and their expectations. Jesus begins to teach them that the Son of Man, his third-party reference to himself, will endure great suffering, be rejected by the religious leaders, and be killed before rising from the dead on the third day. He doesn't tiptoe around any of this. He's very direct in painting this dark picture that lay ahead for him and in the wake of it for his followers too. From now on, the cross, not a military conquest, is looming ahead in Jerusalem. This is not what the disciples had signed up for, or at least not what they thought they were getting with Jesus. They had seen the miracles he had performed. They had witnessed him feed the 5,000 and then the 4,000 with only a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. They had seen him drive out the demon, the unclean spirit, from the man in the Capernaum synagogue. They had watched him heal so many persons, including Peter's mother-in-law. They had even witnessed him bring back a young girl from death. So why now all of this talk about suffering and the death of Jesus? It didn't line up. It didn't line up with who they understood Jesus to be. And Peter tells him so, rebuking him for his bleak picture of the road ahead, before Jesus rebukes Peter for being stuck on the ground rather than rising to heaven in his mind. Jesus, the real Jesus, not the one of their imaginations, achieves victory, not with a sword or a battalion, but by hanging from the cross amidst the brokenness of this world, including his fractured followers. His battle cry isn't death to those who line up against him, but rather forgiveness of their sins at the price of his own death, by which he ultimately conquers both sin and death for everyone. Jesus' triumph is achieved when he emerges from betrayal, beatings, and sacrifice, and the darkness and cold of the grave. This is who Jesus is. This is the anointed one. This is the path he willingly walked on our behalf. Who do you say that I am? Jesus asks his disciples. He asks us the same question. How well do we respond? How well do his words match our picture of who the Christ is? How willing are we to align ourselves with who Jesus really is? I suspect that many, if not most of us, are more than a little uncomfortable with the challenge Jesus puts before us. We may find ourselves leaning toward Peter's way of thinking when we hear Jesus speak of suffering and rejection. He talks about loving our neighbors, but then he carries it beyond our comfort zone and says to love our enemies and do good to those who hate us. He also talks about turning the other cheek when someone backslaps you or otherwise hurts you. Whoa, Jesus, we might be thinking, that's a bit too much. Jesus invites us to follow him. That is, if we're willing to deny ourselves and take up our cross and to find life by losing it. And what does all that mean for us today? As Carla Jones Brown points out, there's a big challenge when seeking to identify Jesus and see him for who he really is, because it causes us to identify ourselves as well. Who are we really as followers of Christ? Because if he's our model and the one whom we're seeking to mirror, then we can't ignore his challenge to deny ourselves and take up our cross. It's not an option. That is, if our aim is to walk closely in his footsteps and to be like him, that's what a follower does, right? So I ask again, what does it mean for us today? This language about self-denial and taking up our cross and losing our life to gain it. J.R. Briggs, writing during the COVID pandemic and the pervasive suffering across the entire planet then, noted that we might ask, in the midst of loss, pain, and death, how we can experience hopeful sorrow instead of hopeless grief. Hopeful sorrow instead of hopeless grief. He says that suffering can be a wise teacher. And one of the lessons persons of faith learn is that we are not alone in our suffering. It is God who accompanies us. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Another lesson taught by suffering, Briggs notes, is that suffering is most meaningful when others join us in it. He points to the example in chapter 2 of Mark, where the friends of a paralyzed man lower him down through the ceiling in order to place him at Jesus' feet so as to obtain his healing, Jesus' healing of him. Because the house is so crowded, they can't even enter through the front door. They do what they can to help their friend. And as Briggs says, those who love us most dearly are those who compassionately walk with us in our times of pain. In doing so, they give us enough strength to simply put one foot in front of the other, even when we feel we can do no other. I'd say this is a great example of what Jesus calls us to do in order to follow him. This is self-denial and a form of taking up our cross. It can be a great sacrifice or just a small gesture, but in each case, intentionality is present as we choose to give up something to help someone else. You see, it's not just enduring suffering. It's trying to alleviate the suffering of another. In our Christian walks, we're not usually called to martyrdom. That's not what I'm talking about here. Our challenge is to do something in the face of a need or sorrow experienced by another. Yesterday, I saw the NBC Evening News. At the conclusion, the so-called "There's Some Good News" segment, a story was featured of a woman in Idaho suffering from cancer who had to have her head shaved. In the clip, no pun intended, her hairdresser, before shaving the cancer patient's hair, suddenly shaved her own head. Right there on the camera, she started shaving her head first. And she said, "Nobody should fight cancer alone, so I'll do it with you." And she shaved her head completely. Amazing. Amazing. That story was followed by one about a bone marrow donor in Alabama. The little 8-year-old recipient ran into the arms of her donor, hugging her tightly without letting go. And at the end of the story, the donor was asked by the news anchor what the bigger message was. And she said, "Just be selfless. Share your kindness, share your heart, share your soul. That's why we're here, to spread love." Now, I don't know whether either of these do-gooders was a Christian, but their actions were certainly consistent with what Jesus is calling his followers, like you and me, to do. To do. We just marked the 23rd anniversary of the terrorist attacks in our nation on September 11th, 2001, when the city of Paris experienced its own terrorist attacks in November of 2015. Evidently, a number of its citizens wrote that more than the thoughts and prayers that so many were sending their way, they wanted their help. The thoughts and prayers were fine, but they needed actions attached to them. Since the church's founding in the first century, Christians have best reflected the identity of Christ, the Anointed One, when they've acted with compassion and reached out physically to those in need or sorrow. Profound example more recently is that of Father Damien de Veuster, if I'm pronouncing his last name somewhat correctly, a 33-year-old Belgian priest who felt called to the Hawaiian island of Molokai. Now, back then, in 1873, when this took place, Molokai was a leper colony. In spite of the personal risks, Father Damien went to serve the lepers of that Pacific island. And he did so faithfully for 12 years before contracting leprosy himself. And then he died 4 years later. Few of us will probably be called to that level of sacrifice. But I also think we shouldn't dismiss the possibility that God may be calling us to a form of Christ-like service with a big impact on others. Look what Louise did with regard to raising money for hunger. Called to something she wasn't even accustomed to. And such impact can be cumulative rather than singular. Fred Craddock, the great theologian, writes, "We think giving our all to the Lord is like taking a $1,000 bill and laying it on the table. Here's my life, Lord, I'm giving it all. But the reality for most of us is that God sends us to the bank and has us cash in the $1,000 for quarters. We go through life putting out 25 cents here and 50 cents there. Usually giving our life to Christ isn't glorious. It's done in all those little acts of love, 25 cents at a time." Let me wrap this up by saying this. Being at cross purposes means two or more persons are at odds with one another regarding their goal or plan. Jesus and his disciples were at cross purposes in today's gospel passage when it came to how the Messiah would act. Peter and the disciples thought that their spiritual leader was also a military general who would exert power with brute force and kick out the tyrants occupying their nation. But this was not who Jesus is, even though they thought he was. Jesus' display of power was usually more subtle, done with a healing touch or a thoughtful word of care. And it was most clearly revealed in and through his suffering, death, and resurrection. Peter and the other disciples were at cross purposes with Jesus about this because, contrary to their expectation, Jesus' purpose was the cross. Jesus fulfilled that purpose. And now he calls us to be his hands and feet for those around us who are suffering or otherwise in need of the healing touch and love of the Christ. Who do you say Jesus is? Your answer will have a great impact on who you are.